Let's talk about John Stuart Mill, who was without a doubt one of the most important thinkers of the 19th century. But to really get a handle on his ideas, you first have to understand the almost unbelievable experiment that was his childhood.
Just take a second to look at this list. This isn't some college course syllabus. This is what John Stuart Mill read before he was even 12 years old. He started learning Greek at age 3. He was, in every sense of the word, a prodigy. But he wasn't born that way. He was made. And the real question is, why?
Well, that brings us to our first section, the prodigy's education. See, this was never just about raising a smart kid. It was a very deliberate experiment by his father, James Mill, who wanted to forge a new kind of intellectual weapon, a mind sharp enough to change society itself.
So every book he read, every lesson he learned, it all had one single driving purpose. Mill was being carefully molded, right from birth, to become the ultimate champion for a radical new philosophy called utilitarianism.
But you know what's so telling? Mill himself was incredibly modest about the whole thing. He genuinely believed that anyone could achieve what he did. And notice his wording here, any boy or girl. Now, for the 19th century, that was an amazingly progressive idea, and it gives us a little preview of his later, groundbreaking ideas on equality.
For his entire youth, Mill was completely devoted to this mission his father had laid out for him. But that purely logical, hyper-rational system that he was raised on, it would eventually push him into a profound personal crisis, one that nearly shattered him.
So, what exactly is utilitarianism? Well, at its core, it's pretty simple. Maximize happiness, minimize pain. The founder, Jeremy Bentham, said that all of humanity is governed by two masters, pain and pleasure. And here's the radical part. In that calculation, he said, everyone is to count for one and nobody for more than one. It didn't matter if you were a king or a commoner. Your happiness counted just the same.
And this idea was incredibly powerful. It wasn't just abstract philosophy. It gave reformers, people they called philosophical radicals, like Mill, a clear framework to push for massive social change. You want to argue against child labor? Well, does it cause more pain than pleasure? Then it's bad, period. It became a powerful tool for progress.
But then, something happened. In his early 20s, right at the peak of his intellectual powers, after dedicating his entire life to achieving these incredible goals, Mill asked himself this one, simple, devastating question. What if we actually did it? What if we achieved all our goals? Would that actually make me happy?
And there it was. The answer that came back was a cold, soul-crushing no. In that moment, the entire foundation of his life, which was built on pure logic and the pursuit of external goals, just crumbled. He realized his education had built this incredible mind, but it had completely starved his heart. He fell into a deep, dark depression, feeling like he had absolutely nothing left to live for.
So, what pulls him out of this crisis of the mind? It was the heart. He found solace in poetry, in music, in nature. But more important than anything else, he met Harriet Taylor, the woman who would completely reshape not just his life, but his entire philosophy.
And their relationship was, well, extraordinary. They fell deeply in love while she was still married to another man. For 20 years, they had this intense, deeply emotional, and for the time, pretty scandalous intellectual partnership. It was only after her husband died that they could finally marry, but tragically, it was only for 7 years before she passed away.
Now, Mill himself gave her immense credit for shaping his work. She did so much more than just bring a human element to his ideas. She challenged his purely analytical way of seeing the world. She pushed him to see that real progress wasn't just about maximizing pleasure, but about individual flourishing, about self-development, about emotional depth, all the things he realized were missing from his own life.
Okay, so this new, more humanistic perspective, born from a personal crisis and nurtured by his love for Harriet Taylor, it fundamentally changed how he approached his work as an economist. He didn't just throw out the classical economics he grew up with, but he started to challenge it, to refine it, with a new sense of humanity.
So this is basically the economic rulebook he inherited. The classical school of guys like Adam Smith believed in a hands-off government, that self-interest was natural, and that the economy operated according to these rigid, almost physical laws.
But the Mill, who had been through the fire of depression, wasn't a dogmatist. He was a huge champion of competition and free markets, for sure. But he also understood that a rigid ideology doesn't always fit the messy reality of the world. And this is the perfect example of that. He's actually the father of what we now call the infant industry argument.
The idea is basically that it might make sense to temporarily shield a brand new, local industry from foreign competition, just to give it a chance to get on its feet. Now, the key word for Mill was always temporary. This was a practical tool, not a permanent shield.
This quote right here gets to the heart of the new Mill. You see, other economists thought the stationary state, a point where economic growth just stops, was a disaster. But Mill, who had lived a life of constant mental struggling to get on and found it totally empty, he saw it as a victory. He imagined it as a time when humanity could finally stop scrambling over each other and focus on art, culture, and justice. A world where, as he said, no one is poor and no one desires to be richer.
So, what does this all add up to? How do you label a thinker who's both a hardcore classical economist and a kind of utopian visionary? Well, it all leads us to his single greatest contribution, and a title for him that feels more relevant today than ever. This is it. This is the big one. Mill's most groundbreaking idea. He argued that we have to make a clean break between the laws of production and the modes of distribution. How we produce wealth, he said, that's governed by natural laws like supply and demand. But how we distribute that wealth once it's created, that is not a law of nature. That is a choice that we as a society get to make.
And guess who he credits for helping him arrive at this revolutionary idea, this idea that bridges cold logic with human choice? Harriet Taylor. He wrote that it was her influence that was crucial in making this distinction, weaving his personal and intellectual journeys together one more time.
And all of this is what makes him what one economist called a radical moderate. Think about it. He was radical in his defense of free markets and competition, believing they were essential engines for progress. But he was also moderate, insisting that we should be pragmatic, not ideological, about stepping in to fix problems and create a more just society.
And that really leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? Mill's entire life was this journey to unite the analytical mind with the feeling heart. He learned the hard way that we need both the cold, hard laws of economics and the warm, aspirational needs of humanity. And in our own, often polarized age, maybe that's his greatest lesson for us.